Testing 3, 2, 1. Does that automatically go to live? Hey, how you doing? It's Steve. It's me. It's Sunday morning, and we are doing the Simpler workshop where we're going to make some instruments. This time I'm going to put a melody on this track. This track needs a melody, and I'll show you a few ways of playing around with a sample to make that happen. So let's see. My monitor screen is on. So I'll turn that off, make sure I can see your comments. I don't know if anybody's on with me yet. Oh, Lori's here. Hey, I got the time zone right. All right, Lori, the Lorinator. How's my vocal audio and music audio level? Can you hear me and hear the sound right? I think I got the sync worked out. I could always use some feedback. I had to put the camera down here today. For some reason, when I put it on a longer USB cable, it would disconnect itself and not stay, like, activated as a webcam. I don't know why. Something about USB audio priorities in the USB bus or something like that. Anyway, I'm talking right now, and there is the music track. I think I might need to bring the music down a little bit. I'm going to do that because I want to make sure y'all can hear. Lori says, I can hear you fine, and the sync is fine. Cool. If the music's too loud, just let me know, and I'll bring it down. So here's a beat I made. I love this track. I've been working on this last week since I started this sampler workshop. And I put in some fun parts, and today I'm going to show you a couple things about just the Simpler instrument. Last week, for everybody who saw us on the replay, we started talking about sampling in Ableton, like using digital audio as a sampler to play back files and make electronic music. That could be beats, it could be synths, bass lines, whatever. There's all kinds of ways of working with digital audio, especially now when all the audio coming off your computer is in one place. Bring up your voice a bit. Okay, I brought the music down a bit. I hope that equilibrates about the same level. Maybe I'll take system audio down a little bit too. And we'll go to Ableton minus 18 dB. Yeah, and I put my headphones back up about there. And I can take more adjustments if you want. So just to make sure you hear me, we're working on Ableton instruments. We looked at, last week we did a survey of Impulse, Simpler, Sampler, Drum Rack, and what they do, how they fit together, and how you can use them to make sounds, basically. And then we went into Impulse, dropped a bunch of samples in there, made a little drum beat. That was really fun, and the point of this whole thing is that limitations give you creativity, okay? So it's easy to load up some sounds and be like, oh, I could play with these options for a million years. There's so much I can do. I have unlimited routing, a million LFOs, all these modulators. And then in the end, you spend 5 hours playing with options, and you don't actually have any fun making the music. It's important to start having fun right away. I like to think of the example, over the last holiday, Thanksgiving, I was riding bikes with my cousin's kids, and these kids have these little kid bikes. So I just jumped on a kid bike and started riding around on the grass and in the driveway and around the yard and everything. And it was so much fun. It was totally different from like official mountain biking where you take food and water and helmet and gloves and you have a map and you plan out a route. You go all day and you're out all day and you're like doing survival in the mountains with your bike and stuff. That's like serious bike riding where if you make a bad mistake, you could get lost all night or something. And that's kind of official, and it's like, yeah, it's amazing, it's fun, bigger hills, bigger experiences, more of everything. Sometimes it's fun to hop on a kid's bike, ride around in the grass, and just instantly have fun without planning anything, just doing it. And that's kind of like what I wanted to show you with the Impulse device. You just drop some samples in, start playing it, and have fun. Today, we're going to go into Simpler, which is the next one. It's not totally complicated, but it has more options than Impulse, and we're going to start making our own instruments. The basic, hey, Daniel Ivanov is here. Hi, Steve, Lori, and everybody in the Sunday workshop. I think it's just us right now. Everybody else is doing something else today, but maybe they'll come in on the replay. Today, so the problem is I got this drum beat, and I want to put a melody on there. It needs a little high-frequency development, and let's go into Ableton. I'll show you. I'll just start. We'll go into screen share. And thanks for being here. So, bing, bing, bing. There we have screen share. Make sure that comes up. So here we go. Here's the track. Last week we started with the Impulse. And that was over there. So just for reference, that's what we began with. And then I added in some bass lines and some other things. Now that we're here in the music, please tell me if you need more voice or less music so I can adjust for that. Devala. Who is Devala? I wish I could remember. I got to write down first names on YouTube handles, but thanks for being here, and let me know what your first name is so I can talk to you. So the problem we're trying to do is, how do I put a melody on this track? Well, First, let's just look at basically the simpler device. Okay, so here's simpler, and to put a sound into it, you can just go to your sample library, go to samples. I'll put in something like synth lead, right? And you audition, find something that sounds like a synth you want to play with, and then you drag it and drop it right onto the simpler window. I got this one that was called Synth Lead Arcade, whatever, and then you activate your record switch, and you can play it. Just from your drum pads, your keyboard, you could even use your computer keyboard with the key switch. And that's the most basic way to get a sound that you can play as a melody. And so let's try it. Here's a little sound. I just made this melody this morning. Oh, it's Oscar. Hey, cool. Oscar plays cool guitar tracks. So here we are with a simple little audio file playing back through the simpler instrument. I made a super short, easy little MIDI clip. And let's hear how it sounds with the drum beat. Okay, I hear that. Problem is, that kind of sounds whack to me. I mean, it sounds, you know, if you're into 8-bit music or like really simple computer music or something, that's fun. Maybe you could put an arpeggiator on there, play with a filter, do some effects or something. Oh, it's Daniel, cool. It's not a terrible sound, but it's not really what I want to do. We got a boring sound. What I wanted to do is make my own sound from a sample. And let me remind you that Ableton is a sampler. So if you wanted to just take a clip, like I had this clip of this bird, and drop it onto an audio track. This is an audio file. Just by launching a clip, you are basically functioning Ableton like a sampler. The clip is digital audio, it's on the hard drive, and launching the clip plays back the digital audio, which is basically all a sampler is doing. It's memory storage of audio, comes back through a converter, comes out the audio outputs, and you trigger it either with a keyboard or push or computer keyboards or something like that. So at the most basic level, Ableton is kind of like a sampler, and you could drag all these different clip slots full of samples to play with, and then manipulate them over here, and transpose them up and down and play with volume. So that's a basic way of looking at it. The problem with this is you can't really play it like a melody, and it's just only playing back that one sound. So what do I do if I want to make a sampler instrument using this melody? Well, the first thing you could do is take an empty sampler, grab your bird audio file, and drop it onto there, and you see it takes over and just becomes the bird audio file. This has a problem because you can see the audio is really small compared to this other one. It's like a quiet sample. It's a field recording. It was not done very loud. So what I want to talk about before we make the instrument is sample prep, which means basic gain staging and cleaning up the sound so that when you put it into your sampler, it's already ready to use. Now, I made this mistake a million times sampling off vinyl records before I even knew anything about recording, where I would record the whole record and then try to process it to use the sample that I wanted. And it was really hard because the sampler didn't have that many options. I didn't have the audio plugins. I didn't have compressors. I didn't have all that stuff. Or to make it even worse, we did have compressors as destructive editing, which means you had to like dial in your compressor settings and press process, and it would go like up to 80, 90%, 100%, and then spit out the output, and you had to listen to it then. And if it didn't sound right, you had to hit undo and wait for it to revert, and then dial in different settings and process it again. It was insane, and there was no way you could get the right compressor settings by doing a destructive A/B testing. Like, no way. So we're basically talking about a recording session right now. So here is the performer, or the the instrument is this bird file, right? So it's a field recording of a bird, a couple loud spikes. It goes through sections. That's the bird. Really cool sound. A friend in Peru gave me this sound. So what I'm going to do is I'll do a little resampling. So I set up a second audio track, audio from resampling. Here is the bird prep file, and let's work with it a little bit. So the first thing I wanted to do was I turned up the gain. Now it's louder. I went right here to sample gain and just cranked it up. I also defined my endpoints of what part of the sound I want to use. Now, originally, samplers had limited memory, so I could not record a 30-second sample even if I wanted to. I had to get it down to like 1 second or less. And that really helps your workflow to define the part you want to work with. I already know I want to work with that. However, I can't even imitate it, but you get the sound I'm trying to work with. And then in the background, there's this cool little bird going. So in technical terms, I'm working with a mid-high range frequency sound. I wanted to turn up the gain to make it louder, and then I wanted to add some effects to make it better. Let's look at the effects chain. Step 1, high-pass filter, about 1500 kilohertz. Get rid of all the low-end stuff. Play that again. I could probably, that might have been a little too high. I could have put it a little lower to get more of that bird's vocal sound. Then the EQ. Made it, modal selector, modal selector. Cool, glad you're here. It's 11:10. So let me know if you can hear the EQ on and off. Tell me a yes if you can hear. If you can hear the difference of that EQ, just type in yes EQ so I know you can hear it. To me, it sounds like before the EQ, it's like a lot of background noise. And then after the EQ comes in, it's like, oh, I can actually hear the voice of this bird that I'm going for. And purely in terms of audio recording theory, what we're trying to do is bring out the most of the sound you want and cut off the parts you don't want. Recording prep right here, we just did a little gain staging to get the loudest possible source we could without distortion. Then, hey, if you're going to use some EQ and filter, do it on the recording input so you don't have to waste time in Simpler. Because remember, Simpler is kind of simple. I have one filter. That means one choice, either high pass or low pass or band pass. I don't have the option of a filter and an EQ and a compressor and all this stuff inside my sampler device. Daniel, EQ, yes, thank you, cool. So just to make this a really easy sample to work with, I did filter, EQ, a little compression, and a limiter to make sure that I don't clip the recording input. So my final sound is like this. And then I just turned on my resampling and recorded it. So I ended up with a sample I could use. So I'm not going to go through the whole process. I kind of set it up ahead of time. Here is the final sample after processing. And I can warp it, turn the warp switch on or off, define the beginning and end point, all that stuff you do with audio. And then I clipped it. So it's a nice short sample, pretty good sound level. I know what's in there, I know what's not in there, and it's ready to work with. So now we're going to look at Simpler and run through a bunch of different ways of using it. So I've got this first channel says MIDI Classic up at the top. We're going to use Simpler Classic mode. That's the one that lets you loop. The icon shows you a little looper thing. And that'll be kind of interesting. Another mode is MIDI one shot. That's the second mode down. That literally plays the sample from start to finish and then stops. Very similar to what we did up here when I said you just launch a clip and you go bump. The playback device starts the thing, plays to the end, and stops. That's all it's doing. And the one shot is like good for, you know, playing a single drum hit or things that are individual sounds that are not like looping or you're not, you'll see what I mean. Finally, we have the slice mode, and I created another instrument for this one, all working from the same basic sample. Slicer is cool because it detects the transients in your audio file, similar to like a beat detective or something, and then spreads them out onto different drum pads. Oops, let me get MIDI coming through here. Oops, and I have a little secret delay on there, and I think I have some reverb, so let me turn all my effects off. So the idea is if you want to hear the original, you play them in order. But it's more fun to slice them up. You can use this with drum beats to get the individual drum hits out on single pieces to play with drum pads for your finger drumming exercises. Or you could take a sentence or somebody singing and chop it up and get all that really tweaked out little kind of stuff that's like the glitchy reprogramming vocals and stuff sound. And believe me, there's a million other things you can do with slicing sounds that are all lots of fun. So how did I use all these different things to create some sounds? Make a melody instrument. So there was the original sample. Oh, I did all that. Classic mode lets you loop. So here's, I'm trying to solve the problem of putting a melody on this beat, right? I was like, okay, the drum beat's cool, I need a melody. Let's see if I can program a melody using this bird instrument as a melody instrument synth. That's not really working. Melody fail. What does that sound like with a beat? This one even needs more volume. So what I can hear is that there is a difference of pitch in these different notes. But this sample doesn't react like a piano or violin or something would. When you pitch shift it, it just sounds really artificial and not in a good way. It sounds like, ooh, somebody's forcing this thing to do something that doesn't sound good. It sounds kind of to me like 1994 electronic music where it's like, and like really kind of fake. So I decided that is totally not working and I'm not going to put that in my track. But I didn't want to stop there. I wanted to go farther and play around with the sound and see what I could do to make it interesting. So I ended up with this. And I made kind of a sound effect. So how did we get there? Well, let's see. Get back into notes mode. We have sample looping. That you can turn on right here. And you can see there's an LFO happening. I wanted to have something changing the sound over time. So I set up an LFO with this sample and hold waveform, routed it to the filter. Here's without the filter. To give it that kind of scrambled effect. And then I use the amp envelope to make the sound fade in over time and then fade out. So this is what it would be like with just the amplitude. And I was thinking, you know, sound effects are cool when they sort of fade in and come at you and then move out of the way, like the Doppler effect, like. So I use the amplitude envelope to have the perception of something coming closer and then going farther away. I use the filter envelope for sort of the same way where the tone is changing over time. And then I had the LFO modulate the filter with this delayed attack time, so it doesn't start right away. It happens over time a little bit. Maybe we could even modulate the pitch. What's that sound like? Gets a little bit glitchy, and I think I put some reverb on that. Yeah. So I abandoned the idea of having a melody come from the classic mode simpler because it just wasn't working with that original sample. And instead, I found some ways to do creative sound design to make it do something interesting that I could use. And the last thing I did was I turned on the glide effect so it would smoothly morph between notes. So when I programmed these two MIDI notes, I didn't want to hear that pitch jump because remember, the pitch felt kind of artificial. So to solve that problem, I turned on the glide, set a glide time so that between the two notes it'll go like meow and make a smooth slide between pitch and not sound fake. Let's see what it sounds like. Maybe a little too much pitch modulation. And let's hear that in the beat. So that became kind of like a background sound, a little bit of a sound design exercise. And sampling, I think I put a principle in here. Limits make creativity. If you're trying to do one thing and it completely fails, don't throw it away, turn it into something else. So that the experiment to make a melody with that classic mode didn't really work for me, and I turned it into something else with a sound design experiment. Let's try making melody with a single shot sound. Here is the first attempt. Same kind of deal. I took a melody with, a few notes, really simple melody. This time you can hear that it's a melody, but I think I did it on a higher octave. That was B3. What was that first one? Oh, same octave. And because it's a one-shot thing, you're hearing like the chirp sound on the melody sound, and it's not looping and making all that extra like noise and space behind it. So when I use the fade out parameter like the amp envelope, I could chop it down to a really short thing where it almost has a defined pitch, and that let me work with it much more like an actual melody sound instead of this scribbled out fuzz kind of thing. Let's hear how that sounds in the beat. Ooh. Sorry, there we go. So we're getting closer. The repetition thing is working for me. I'm hearing a bunch of sounds happening, but I don't really love how the melody feels, partly because it's not the most amazing melody in the world, but also the sound doesn't quite lend itself to being like, you know, the traditional like, oh, it's a synth melody or something, piano or whatever. So I thought, well, what else could I play with to make this more interesting? The principle I really want to get at is that having limits makes you get creative, and the whole art of sampling. Let me go back on camera for this. And if you have any questions by now, I forgot to ask for questions a minute ago. We're about 20 minutes in. If you have any questions about sampling, the Ableton stuff, or what the hell am I talking about, type them in now. I'll take a quick little break from showing you stuff and talk about it. The basic thing I'm going for is that sampling gives you a piece of audio that's fixed. It's not like a MIDI synth where you can tweak parameters and design the sound. It's like the audio is kind of fixed, and you have to find a way of working with it to make it interesting. So all the tools we have in the audio world still apply to that, like EQs, filters, pan position, LFO, amp envelopes, filter envelopes. Those things are available, but they're being applied to a sound that isn't quite as flexible as a synth. On a synth, when you go up the keyboard, you hear something that sounds like that instrument in a natural way, but at a higher pitch. But with samples, when you go up the keyboard, the sample gets to be a higher pitch, it transposes higher, the duration gets shorter, it sounds more like little birds chirping, and it's not as realistic as an instrument. Also, when you go down the keyboard, it's even worse. It goes whoa, 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 and slows down so much it doesn't sound like a pitch at all, which is why it's kind of hard to make bass instruments using samples. We're going to work on that in another lesson. So right now I'm trying to show you the different modes in Simpler for working with samples, either when you're looping something or using one-shot samples or doing slicing. And so far we've gotten a bunch of the way through, but let's see if I have any questions. Not right yet. So, and then running into limits is like, well, it didn't work as a melody, so maybe I can morph it into something else. And I got that cool sound design sweep thing. It's like using the portamento glide. And then on this next one, I'm going to show you how I used repetition and a pitch envelope to make the sound do something cool that fits in the track and depart totally from the idea of like 12-tone keyboard tonality. You don't have to have fixed pitches to have a cool melody. You just have to have something in the high frequency that's working with the rhythm and sounds interesting. So if you have any questions, type them in. I'm going to go back into live and keep going. Right, are we in the screen share there? I hope so. Yeah. So here's our one-shot melody fail. Ugh. And then what if I do something like this? Suddenly that's getting kind of interesting. And less is more. I believe I put that in the place to highlight. Let's make that one blue. So now I just took the same note, repeating over and over again, and instead of trying to play it on the keyboard like a piano, like if this thing doesn't want to be a piano, don't force it, I made a pitch envelope. So I'm just like pitch bending this thing as it repeats and using that to fit it into the track. So it's sort of referencing the harmony, but it's just kind of sounding cool and doing something in the background. So now we have two sounds coming and going. One of them is doing the approach and go away to a distance kind of a sound. And this one's doing like an up and down sort of message. So it's like, first it goes all the way down. Wait for the loop to come back. And it goes all the way back to the top. What's going to happen next? It's going to go back down. So this is like a little bit of a storytelling thing in the track where you just have these two sounds that are repeating. They come and go out of your awareness. One of them is going from close and far, the other one's going high to low. And the interplay of those two things makes it interesting to listen to on top of the bass line and the beats. So the beat's carrying you along, you're in the groove, you're just listening to it. Now the melody is there to, you know, express a story, interaction, something that starts, has a beginning, goes away from the beginning on a journey, and then goes back to the beginning again. All that basic stuff about what is happening in music, I'm trying to recreate with sampling, and I kind of like what's happening right now. I think I just had one reverb on there. And did I forget to turn my filter back on? Yeah. And then to round this out, I put a high-pass filter on there so I could play with it later as a modulator and a glue compressor. My idea was something like this. So at the top it's like filtered, and then going back up. So I got several layers of modulation happening that combine to make the sound develop over time, have some complexity, some richness, some sonic texture that grabs your ear. It's very different from, look at how far away we started with this single idea for a melody up here. That sound is like a piece of cardboard. It's the same every time. It has a little bit of a melody slide, but it doesn't have anything like interesting about it. So I wanted the kind of an organic sound that's doing something cool. And again, I know we're not making a imitation violin on a synthesizer that sounds like an orchestral instrument. That's really not what I'm here for. If you want an orchestral violin synth, you should probably just get it from one of the Ableton libraries where it actually sounds like a beautiful violin that you could play. This workshop on sampling is the things I'm showing you can use to make playable instruments when you start with different samples. I think I chose something difficult to show you the problem solving that I encounter because that leads to really creative stuff that you can have fun with. So the technique, I guess, is just repetition with a modulator. And I want a T in the repetition, repeat the T. The repetition is just playing the same note over and over again as a MIDI note, and then the modulator was recording some automation with the pitch bend so that we get that. And don't be afraid with electronic music to repeat the crap out of it, because it is a very repetitive art form. And the more you repeat stuff, the more you get bored with the repetition, find some place to change it, and make it turn into something else. So now let's go into slicing mode. It's 11:27. Good, we're on time. I got to split at 12 because I have a gig this afternoon. So slicing mode is where you drag the sample into the simpler, you put it on slice mode, and it makes these cool little transients so you can play it in sequences. So here's what you're going to hear. It's a bunch of MIDI notes, and they sound like this. So what Ableton did was chop this up into different pieces where I can play them. I'm still slow on push. Sorry about that. I wanted this. So I have one drum pad right here. Another one for that one. That's an interesting sound. It's kind of like the one before it, but a little bit different. So I have an option for variation. And there are some cool options on here. You can slice by transient, you can slice by beat, manually, depending on what your incoming sample is. And then the playback is quite cool. I have it on mono because I only want to hear one piece at a time. If you set it on poly, like polyphonic or multiple sounds, you can play them overlapping. And you hear all the sounds at the same time overlapping. You can set your voice limit like that. I wanted to hear it in a crisp way with only one sound at a time, so I set it on monophonic to make sure the other samples cut them off. Now that reminds me of something else we did with Impulse. Do you remember something about hi-hats where we had one sample cut off another sample? Type in what we did for the example on that if you remember the example in Impulse of cutting off one sound using an option with the other sound. It was over here. No, I just gave you the answer. In the hi-hats with open and closed, there was a way to do this. And use the closed hi-hat to cut off the open hi-hat to get that realistic sound of like tsk, tsk, tsk. So we're doing that now in kind of a different way with the slicer, where we have mono playback. So all the samples, like the newest one, will play and cut off whatever was coming before, which is useful here because I'm making a rhythmic pattern and I don't want it to get all slushy and messed up. I want it to sound kind of clean. Daniel, Impulse Link, totally nailed it. I know there's a time lag, so I had to wait for that chat to come through. So here we are listening to this drum beat on monophonic. What if I put it on poly? It's not awful, but it's a little fuller maybe. And then when you put it on the through mode, it plays through the end of each sample and it really gets kind of messy. I wanted to use this basically as turning our bird sample into part of a drum beat, or a drum beat pattern, even though it's a melodic sort of note. What's that sound like in the beat? Now I'm totally happy with this. This is like an interesting kind of a sound. It's making rhythmic pattern. It feels like a drum beat, but it's not like, oh, here's the snare drum, here's the hi-hat. It's this other like squeak kind of a thing. And I think I need some more effects on here. There we go. So just like that, I have a cool little sound in the track that's happening, bloop, just right there. Again, a little auto filter for later, a lot of compressor, and then what happens? Less is more. Did I write that down? I did. Yay. I love planning out lessons. I had some time this morning to plan out the lesson, and I was like, I'm going to hit them with the principles. Less is more. I skipped over the technique nudging slices. What that means is when you're setting up your pieces, you can zoom in and put the actual start point really right where you want it to get the beginning of a transient. So for example, your hand claps will be right on the hand clap, really crisp, or you'll get the word at the beginning of the word if you're chopping up a word. Whatever it is, you can dial that in detail. And why did I put a filter on here? Well, I wanted some stereo action. Oh, and I made this into a cool little instrument too. Let me know if you want this instrument. I racked these up and mapped them a little bit, and I was thinking I could give you the presets or actually save out this whole project as a live pack that has the presets and sounds and instruments in there. So let me know if you want to play with these things. I'm not sure if it's going to be useful to you to like go through the steps that I did and recreate it yourself, or if you just want to take the containers, drop a new sound in, and play with your own instruments in there. But let me know how you feel about that, because I like making instruments and I'm happy to save them out and put them in the session. Oh, and by the way, in last week's lesson on the December 1st tour of samplers, I also made a live pack from that session that you can download from inside the replay area. So go back to the replay, look in the lessons, there's a download of the live pack, and you can play with some stuff in there. I think it's a cool thing to do, because now we're doing workshops and you could actually get your hands on the sounds. So what was I talking about? I was talking about making this slice beat more interesting with filter. And with the filter volumes, I set it up so we have a left, right, and a center delay on different times, so the sample actually feels like it goes left to right as the delays come in. Here's the left. And here comes the center delay. And then the right side delay. So all together, so the longest one stays on the right side, and it feels like the sample is kind of moving from left to right as you hear it in the track. which I think that's super cool. I have fun doing this stuff. Now let's put all these three together. We have this pitch envelope and we have the glide melody. What happens if we play them all at the same time? Maybe I should explain these two together. I made it so that the up and down pitch envelope leads into this one hit over here, okay? So this hit right here on beat 4 is happening at like the end of the pitch envelope where it kind of like slides up and delivers you into that, and then the next time the loop goes around, it slides down, and hits that 4-beat thing. So that's like strategic sequencing. We're getting just out of sampling into sequencing where it's like I have these sounds, they're doing something interesting, where am I going to put them in the track to make it useful? And then this, what do you call that? The approaching sound design one fills in the gap before the second hit on measure 2. So like from measure 1 and 2, there's that pitch shift thing going do-do-do-do-do-do-do. And then in the second measure, there's that sound that kind of fades in and goes away. So together, the three of them make an ongoing texture of sounds where one of them is coming and going like volume, one of them is shifting up and down like pitch, like the elevator, and then the third one is that blink sound that goes that's like punctuation between the three of them. So they're it's like braiding. It's like braiding three sounds together to fill up time across your track. And essentially, if you think about sampling, I think I'm going to go back to camera for a minute. Hi, if you think about making electronic music with samples, all you're doing is taking empty space, triggering enough samples to fill it up to turn it into music. That is literally all we're doing. If you had to make music with nothing but a sampler, your goal is basically get enough samples and play them often enough that it covers up the space, fills up the time, and creates music. So what would you do? Well, obviously, you'd start with like, okay, a kick drum, a beat, and the beat is repetitive. It has gaps in between the beats, but you know to expect another piece, so that changes your perception of time. And then you need some harmonic stuff to like bridge across the empty spaces in between the samples. And it's like a totally different way of thinking about making music. It's not like, oh, here's my lyrics, here's my melody, here's my chords, here's my bass line, here's my drummer at last. It's not like that at all. It's like thinking there's a metronome, like an invisible metronome ticking all the time. I have to put a sample on that metronome or else we're going to have silence. And the samples I put on it could be absolutely anything I get from any source anywhere in the whole entire world, from a vinyl record, your phone recorder off like YouTube or something on your computer, or like a sample pack, or anything you can chop up can turn into a little piece of audio that you trigger on a beat or in between the beats to make like a mosaic tapestry, layer all kinds of stuff together, and it turns into sound and music at the end. Let me know if that makes sense. Type in tapestry if that makes sense. Have you ever seen like one of those bathroom floors where instead of being like a perfect grid of tile, they take all these broken pieces of tile and make a mosaic with a little picture in it? And it looks really cool, and it's made from all these broken pieces of thrown away tile that would never be useful until you put them together to make art from it. Sampling is a lot like that, where you can buy, you know, crappy old records that nobody wants to listen to and the album itself sucks, but you sample one little thing off there and all of a sudden you get this idea for a whole track that's really exciting and interesting, and it's an artistic endeavor, dimensions beyond the original scratched up vinyl record that you dug out of a crate somewhere. This can be years and years and years of fun. Literally, it is so much fun. I hope you get from this workshop that, number one, sampling is unlimited. Number two, it is hard to work with samples, but the limits of what they can do force you to be creative and find lots of different ways to use them. Instead of making the sample do what you're expecting, what you do is like you come towards the sample and you're like, what do you want to be fitting in this track? How do you want to fit in this track? And you kind of go with that. So I started out with this beat trying to make a melody. The samples were like, nope, we're not going to work as a melody. And so I had to find a different way of filling up the high frequency space with something repetitive that sounded cool, that functioned like a melody, but not like a traditional piano player write it down on sheet music. Like the stuff we made with Simpler today, you couldn't express it in sheet music. You know, you saw the MIDI notes, but they tell you nothing about what we're actually hearing. Oh, not saying no to any device rack you want to throw at us. Copy that. Thanks. Yeah, Lori says mosaic of sound. Great. I know you're with me, but I just like to ask for feedback so to make sure I'm not missing anything important. Yeah, man. So, you know, sampling and creating music from samplers, I love this. This is where I came from making tracks, and it means a lot to me to be able to show this because it's not very common for people to teach this anymore, of like starting with only a record, sampling pieces, and put it into a piece of music. I know people do it, but I wanted to show you my take on it. So I'm going to dip back in here and see what else we can cover in the rest of today. And I like listening to this track. This is just a fun beat. I was talking about braiding together 3 samples to cover up time. I want you to know that didn't just happen by accident either. This sample on the 2 and the 4, the reason I chopped down the full beat and kept this one is because that was the biggest drum hit that could make sense in the track without getting in the way. So I like this, but it gets a little too repetitive. That one hit does not get repetitive. This little guy right here, I could listen to that all day. Now notice what's going on right here. The start point is nowhere near the beginning of the loop, and the loop is not on an even bar measure. What I did first was I just played some melody notes and recorded it in there. But then when I was listening to it, I felt like it's not sitting with anything in the melody. It was kind of, I mean, in the track, it was like sort of competing against the wrong stuff, and then there was empty space when I wanted something to happen. So I just made a 4-bar loop and shifted it around using the up and down arrow key, and then I even had to move the start marker to make sure that this first note came in on the rhythm and extended to fill up a space I wanted to fill up. And the thing that ended up working, which I liked, is that it pitches down and ends up on beat 4 to hit that slice sound. And I said this before. Then the second time, it pitches back up and leads your ear into that sound. So this is like a punctuation mark on the end of a phrase, and this little melody thing is like a phrase. And then the other one also did not start off the way I expected. It started off as a longer, a loop with more notes in there. I had to play through it a couple times to find out where does that sound fit to fill up the melody. Let's hear it at the beginning state. Here's experiment 1. And that's not wrong. It's not like a bad thing, but it works a lot better here. And what I was going for here was having this sound occupy something that was like an empty space in the beat instead of starting at the beginning. Because honestly, if you have all your sounds start at bar 1, beat 1, everything's going to get overlapping. You're not going to hear the details in any one of those sounds, and you'll have a hard time filling up your loop because everything's starting at the same time. So instead, move the start marker out a little bit and, you know, change the rhythmic spacing every time. Question from Lori: how about using bits and pieces of a repetitive element in a round-robin style to give more texture to a sound? Yeah, that kind of rephrases what I'm trying to say. Maybe you said it better than me. Let me think about that. Bits and pieces of a repetitive element in a round-robin style to give more texture to a sound. I would like to hear you do that, to hear what you are imagining, because that makes me think of all kinds of stuff, and I'm not sure if I'm showing you what you want to see or if you're thinking of something that I'm not doing. So if you can make that happen and share it, I would love to hear it, or describe more of what you want me to do, and I'll be happy to try doing it. Let's see, did I get to the bottom? Wow, I'm at the bottom of my lesson. So we got down to the beginning of sequencing, really. This leads to, sampling obviously leads to sequencing, and I guess we just kind of fell headfirst into that one. Oh, little technique. You know I have my bus groups, right? Let's turn off my reverbs. All right, so there's the low group. Now we have the instruments with the bass line happening, the upper bass line. Let's get all these into a boost. But what I decided to do was send this sound out to the drums group, because for me it's really morphed into being part of the rhythm. Maybe the level should be down a little bit. So right here, I could listen to the low end and this sample within the drum beat, and we are beyond the domain of melody, harmony, composition on 5-line staff paper. We're just making sounds, putting them in rhythm, and doing it by feel. And then we got the other stuff coming too. So the takeaways I want you to bring home in your brain are principle, less is more. When you're sampling, don't try to do everything, just make the sample work in a new way. We looked at the technique of nudging slices in slice mode. So here we are with our sampler instrument, and I took this original sample file, just an audio file, dragged it right onto the simpler device, and it automatically sliced it. You can choose your slicing parameters and then get individual slices on drum notes, drum pads, or keyboard keys that you can play back and reconfigure the sample in a new way, which is super fun. We also looked at doing MIDI one-shot envelopes, where I just triggered the sample and had it start over and over and over. And we used that with a repeating MIDI note and a pitch envelope on the note. We didn't go too deep into the controls on this one. I used a low pass filter and pretty much that was it. Quick and dirty. And then we also looked at MIDI classic mode that really didn't do anything for me as a synth instrument creation, but I got into an interesting place doing sound design with this one and making our using the loop function to have that sound morph over time. I applied an LFO to the pitch and to the filter so it would change over time and do something interesting. Classic mode is the one that lets you loop. One shot is for like individual drum hits playing back and forth, and you'll see that a lot more when we get to drum rack, where every drum hit is a simpler. And then slice mode is, you could go a lot deeper in this to create all kinds of interesting chopped up stuff. We should probably do that next week, dropping complete drum loops into Slicer and playing them back, re-sequencing. At the end, I got into talking about how these 3 samples that we created, or instruments that we created, they all sound cool. I don't want them to compete with each other. I don't want them to all start exactly on the beginning of the beat. So I looked at spreading them out over time and having these 3 sounds interact with each other to lead us through a cycle. For me, the end point of the cycle is this hit right here. Pow! So if I'm like out dancing and I hear that sound, I'm gonna react to it. Be like, every time that comes around, something happens. It's kind of cool. The pitch shift one is alternately going up and down to lead us back to that one drum hit. And then the glide melody is fading in and out with volume and a frequency sweep. It's kind of a noisy, nasty sound, but in terms of sound design, it's kind of cool to have these little visitors. You know, you put some reverb and delay on them, and they turn into something that's kind of sounds like music. So it's 10 minutes to noon, and I'm sorry I got to take off early, but I got to take off to get to a funny gig this afternoon. Let me just fade that down enough. So I'm going to get back out to the main window. There we go. Hey, thanks for watching. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'm really happy we can do these workshops together on weekends in the daytime or your afternoon and work on live and stuff. And it looks like it's starting to transform from teaching something about the Ableton devices into making a custom instrument to share. That is super fun for me. So what I'm going to do is take this session, export the instruments and presets, and maybe I'll record a little bit of the lesson in there, so it's like a session lesson pack that you can open up and play with later. And if you're watching this on replay, answer on the quiz question. Let me know, do you want this live pack to play with the instruments? I know that the bird sample is a weird sample, but remember, all you have to do is go to your sample library, take a sound that you like, drop it into the simpler, and the whole container is going to work. So the filters, the effects, the macro knobs, all those things are going to apply to whatever sample you drag in there. You can hot swap them in and out. And that might help you get farther along with playing with sounds, you know, see what other samples you drop in there, what you come up with. Even if it's not a lightning bolt of enlightenment, it might be just fun to spend some time making tracks. Main takeaway principles from the day. Pay attention, this is important. Sampling has limits, and the limits actually make you get creative. Back in the 90s, everybody was trying to make the most bomb sampler they could with all kinds of options, unlimited parameters, everything you could think of. And then what happens is the options start to totally enslave you, and you're like, oh, I'm not doing enough. I should make it more. I should use this. I should put this on here, add this, add that. And suddenly you're getting buried all deep in there, and you're not even having any fun. So don't be afraid to do something really simple, really dumb, really repetitive, and really fun, and then like put one filter on it and call it a day. One and done. Sampling is really fun like that. And Lori says, always make a live pack. They're always interesting. Thank you, Lori. I know you're big on backups too, Lori. For everybody who doesn't know, Lori's like the digital queen of telling me to back up my stuff. I just ordered a new hard drive, Lori. It's coming. I'm going to back up everything. And I appreciate that. Yeah. So for the future, we have some work to do with sequencing beats. We're going to get drum beats sliced out into discrete samples that we can use and program with finger drumming or whatever. And then I think I should pay attention to the sequencing phenomenon. It's so much fun. You get a loop, you plug in drums in different spots, you hear how it sounds, you have accidents, the accidents sound cool, you improvise. It's really a lot of fun, and that's getting at the core of what making electronic music is all about. You know, you get some sounds, slap them together, change them around to make it your own. You do something that everybody's going to recognize because it's familiar and feels good. Like a sandwich, it's like, you know, there's going to be bread and something in the middle, but whatever you put in the middle is all up to you. And I guess at a higher level of sequencing, think about like empty space with a metronome going through it, and it's up to you to just put like beats and sounds on those empty spaces, so as they're coming at the audience, there's always something happening. No matter where you are in the track, there's something coming and going, little visitors like choom choom going through your headphones or through the dance floor. And that's what makes your music really interesting to listen to, so it's not a predictable, boring drum loop that came out of a sample pack that everybody knows what to expect, and it sounds like a dishwashing soap commercial or something that you hear on TV. So that's me for today. If you have any questions, type them on in. I'll get back to them either through the Member Vault quiz function or on chat comments under here. And I'm going out. Oh, yeah. So I have a high school play that I'm doing mics for, mixing mics. They rented like 16 clip-on mics for this high school play this weekend. So I'm running out to like run the mute switches, and I got to follow along on the script and see actors coming in and out and entering and exiting. It's really hard, actually. Like mixing a band, I never realized this, but when you're mixing a band, they mostly stay put. Like maybe the singer goes back and forth a little bit, but the drummer's right there. He can't move because the drums. The bass player stands in front of the bass amp. The guitar player is in front of the guitar amp. And everybody stands in front of their mic. So you don't really have to look at them to see what's happening. But when I'm running mics for this show, there are people literally running in from backstage, running across the stage, saying a line and then leaving. And I have to like catch it and open the mic when they're there and then mute the mic again. And there's 16 mics and you have to know who's on which mic. And there's 16 of them. So it's more than you can memorize, especially when you're far away from the stage and you don't know these people and you don't know the play. It's like, oh my gosh. Daniel seconding that, and thanks for the idea shared, Steve. Hey, thanks a lot. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. I'm going to sign off for now, and I'll catch you in the group. Bye. Where's my button? End broadcast.